Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Omar, for having invited me tonight. So Leslie did a great job introducing my work and some of the topics I hope to enlighten you with tonight. But I will mostly speak about what it has meant for me to work as a photographer who works in the real world. Some of you may call that documentary photography, some of you may call that straight photography. I like to say that I prefer to work in the real world. I also wanted to talk to you about what it means for me to make work that you may call autobiographical. I think mostly I wanted to talk to you about all of the issues I've struggled with, more or less throughout various projects. You know, are you political? Are you an activist? Are you for war, against war? So is the work autobiographical? All of these questions that have been kind of swirling in my head that hasn't, you know, they've not always been clear. And I think at this point, after so many projects, I feel that I'm in a good spot. But I think my MO has always been to try to ask a few questions before I start a project, reassess at the end, and then think about what has not been answered, and then take those questions onto the next project. But again, I think at this point in my life, I've realized that, you know, everything's a mess, and you may as well just embrace the mess. And it actually has helped me feel much more comfortable about being a straight photographer, being somebody who works in the real world. So I think my big realization is that, and of course the Vietnam War, Vietnam and where I come from has always been such a huge part. I think my big realization was to understand that Vietnam is a place, it's a war, it's also an idea. And there's no point in trying to make sense out of any of it. And I'll show you a bunch of pictures that sort of explain what this mess is about, and I've decided to just kind of embrace it. So it's a mix of news pictures, family pictures, some pictures I've made that I may not consider my real pictures, snapshots, but also some real pictures. And you'll see that it's this kind of interesting mess that maybe say something about how it's, in a way, very postmodern, this whole idea of sign and signifiers. It's all about that. This is a news photograph by a French photographer. This is a photograph I made upon my first trips returning to Vietnam in the late 90s when we renewed relations with Vietnam, and Clinton lifted the embargo, and Vietnamese Americans were able to return home. So this was my first time returning home after 20 years. Family pictures from Vietnam in the early 60s. This is from the news. This is the Australian Royal Air Force airlifting orphans at the end of the war in 1975. This is a still from Full Metal Jacket. This is me on the deck of a small aircraft carrier with some Special Force guys, Marine Corps. This is a Vietnam War reenactor. This is a photograph I made during one of the early trips to Vietnam. Platoon. This is a snapshot of me and my kids. We were visiting some friends in Newport, and they pulled out all of their old toys for my kids to play with. The bombardment of the North during the war. This is a photograph I made a couple of years ago on the set of a Civil War film. This was from the New York Times travel section about visiting Vietnam and these infamous Cu Chi tunnels. And they're quite extraordinary. This is a photograph of the Seabees constructing a flight path during the Vietnam War. This is the early construction of Michael Heiser's city. This is a more recent photograph of his project. This is a small commission that I did for Dear Beacon. They're photographs of a quarry along the Hudson. Larry Burroughs. And this is a photograph made by a North Vietnamese photographer during the war. And it's obviously very set up and propaganda. This is something I made off the coast of Vietnam more recently. And Women at Work, Catherine Leroy, she's a French photographer during the Vietnam War. This is a Viet Cong. And this is me during a reenactment. And 19th century photographers with their cameras. And this is mine. It's a lot smaller, but you know, it creates all kinds of issues to work with that kind of camera. And I'll talk more about why. But so as you see, it seems that at various times I've tried to answer certain things about all of those issues, and I think it's just interesting to try to not have straight answers for everything, meaning what is war, how is it represented? I've been as much as influenced by films and books as I think a lot of Americans have, but I've also lived through the war. And so it's about juggling all of that, and it's about trying to carry through these complicated ideas about what war is, about preparations for war, the consequences of war, and also, you know, the baggage that you carry coming to these projects, because obviously it influences everything. So I think there are a lot of students here, so I just wanted to show some old work that I made and how, that I made before I even started thinking about war. This is the work that I made before graduate school. I was not trained as a photographer. I was trained as a biologist and discovered photography by chance. And I completely fell in love with photography. For me, it was an excuse to try to learn more about the world, to try to answer questions about things I didn't quite understand. And I think that is sort of at the core of what has made me, you know, somebody who wants to continue working in the real world. I think the world is full of surprises, and there's just so much to learn out there. So it is very narrow, and you know, that idea of what is authorship, what can you do when you can't really, it seems that you can't really change things and manipulate things, or you can't synthesize so much. You know, I think there's a huge leeway. You know, I lived in France for a while, so I photographed in workshops, and I showed up at graduate school with these pictures that were praised, and they were mysterious, and they have a sense of narrative. They were made with a view camera, and they were beautiful. But I think ultimately it was always the question, but who are you, and where are you in these pictures? And I think it was something that I struggled with, especially because this was in the early 90s, and I could not return to Vietnam. I think this was at the beginning of setup photography, Pierre Decorsia and Gregory Crutzen. And I think, you know, I was kind of torn on to where to go. So not being able to go to Vietnam, I came up with these little still lives that are very arty that I made the last year of graduate school. So a lot of these pictures were made by the French, and someone gave me a lot of old chemistry glassware, and I just used them to create these still lives. And that's how I finished graduate school. But I started thinking about what it meant to be born in Vietnam and have your life completely dictated by American foreign policy. And so, you know, very quickly, Vietnamese Americans were able to return to Vietnam, and I wasn't quite sure what I would do. In my head, I would just go there and perhaps make more still lives in situ. But as soon as I got there, I realized that it was all about scale, and I became a landscape photographer. So what do I mean by scale? Scale meaning, I think, giving somebody a kind of physical experience in terms of navigating a landscape, giving somebody the experience that it's about an individual within a larger context, and how to layer a photograph and make it complicated. The landscape was very unfamiliar to me because, during the war, it was a lot safer to stay in the big cities. And so even the delta of the Mekong, which was so close to where we lived, Saigon, was very dangerous. So you would drive through and go wherever, but you never really stopped. And of course, I didn't know the North, which is where my family was from. And so I think all of those pictures really spoke to me. I think ultimately what these pictures are about also is, I think, trying to make real some of these memories I had of what growing up in Vietnam was, also patching up some of the holes I had because of the war. So there were a lot of things I didn't experience. So I'd heard stories from my grandmother, I read folk tales. So it was a mix of things that I kind of relied on to guide me and intuitively told me where to place the camera and what kind of pictures to make. I photograph a lot of children, of course. There's something fantastical about the landscape. I played soccer a lot when I was a kid, so every opportunity to make a picture with a soccer game I did. The pictures have a certain nostalgia, and I certainly didn't try to avoid what was contemporary, and Vietnam had changed a lot. And so it was something that I accepted, but I think the core of the work really speaks to, I think, something ineffable that meant for me Vietnam, quote unquote. And of course, it's something else for somebody else, but this is what it was for me. So I went to Vietnam every year for about 4 or 5 years. I think I was very afraid of making pictures that were superficial. I think the idea of traveling as a tourist and being so seduced by everything was very much on my mind, and so I always spent a lot of time there. So it was a huge project with a lot of time away, but I think ultimately when I was putting all those pictures together, it seemed that what I really missed was the idea of the war, and I avoided all of that. So again, being a photographer who likes to work in the real world, I was at loss as to what to go on to next. And by chance, I heard about this. I heard that there were groups of men who reenact the Vietnam War in America. And this was in 2000, early internet. I did a search, and I found a group in North Carolina and Virginia, and that was the closest to New York. And I contacted them and decided to go down and work with them. So they meet 3 times a month every summer, so maybe they meet 6, 7 times every summer. It was by invitation. I had to kind of ingratiate myself and be invited. So they had very strict rule, and some of these guys reenacted Civil War, they reenacted World War II. They decided it wasn't contemporary enough, and they moved to Vietnam. They're very conservative guys, and the question is, were they in the military? No. If they were drivers or they were in the National Guard. They never experienced combat. And this was a way for them to experience something that was more real. They grew up collecting, all the gear. They know everything about all the movies. They read all the books. And this was a way to somehow experience it. They are sticklers, they almost, my husband says that they're like they're as obsessed as the men who go in drag. Some of them learn to sew the patches. You know, they could have the right haircut. You couldn't bring a hamburger. You know, it was you had to buy Vietnam-era uniforms. I had to buy Vietnamese-made pajamas. So they gave me a choice. They said, you know, what do you want to be? And I said, well, what would give me the most freedom? And they said, well, you could be a Viet Cong, and then you could be, you could start on the Viet Cong side, and then you could be captured and go on the GI side. And I said, all right, I'll do it. But it was very creepy, and it was very strange. So all right, so that was the first big step. You know, I was there in the middle of it, and now what kind of work do you want to make? I brought medium format camera. I made the prints. I didn't really like the quality. It wasn't physical and experiential enough, so I thought that I should switch to a large format camera. And you know, there's great inspiration from the Civil War photographers, from Roger Fenton, and there's a great history of people photographing, avoiding action because they couldn't do it. So you photograph before, you photograph after, you move things. You know, Timothy O'Sullivan moved bodies around. This is a medium format picture, so it shows the North Vietnamese VC camp, and I slept in that hut. The guys are very nice, very conservative. They, you know, we all know this picture, and of course they reenact this. And I think, of course I made the picture, how could you not? But I think it was clear to me that I did not want to replicate or reproduce or somehow get involved with these iconic moments, because I felt that we knew them so well, and I didn't have anything to add, and it's the stuff that I actually tried to avoid. So what else is left? And I think what's left is, for me, really interesting. It's the lingering myth about Vietnam. And so this is 2000, and you walk into a bookstore, and it's incredible, the bookshelves full of books on Vietnam, and this was before the Middle East, so all of the great war movies were still Vietnam War movies, or you go back to the 50s and you look at some of the World War II and World War I. But, and so, you know, all those guys were trafficking in that myth, and there were so many unresolved things, and I thought that I could use them as a way to kind of engage with, I think, the fact that Vietnam, there hasn't been closure, and that Vietnam is still such a huge thing in the popular imagination. And so, you know, the idea of landscape also is something I wanted to explore, and this is a field, and then it's transformed into a landing zone. The idea of landscape as strategy, the idea of landscape as a character. So, you know, we have Vietnam in North Carolina. That was interesting to me. I had to deal with this idea of the setup in real, you know, honest, in honest, real ways, because I couldn't run around with those guys. And so some of the pictures felt staged, and this was one of the more elaborate one. You know, it's a Vietnam-era jet. But I think that it's okay that there's a disjunction, because it's about reenactment. I'm not using the reenactors to do something else. They went through great lengths. They grew bamboo on the property. They had night battles, which were pretty spectacular. It's a homemade explosives, or they use fireworks, and they put kitty litter in some of the stuff that exploded, so if it rained on you, you knew you were hit. They didn't use paintballs, so they all shot blanks. They didn't have real scenarios, but they had activities. So one weekend it would be special force, and then another weekend it would be long reconnaissance, you know, patrols. And they often used me as part of the scenario. You know, I would be part of the ambush, and but I had a list of, you know, of course I was inspired by what they were doing, but I also had a list of pictures that I wanted to make, and many of them were inspired by, of course, my, even though I I lived through some of the fierce fighting in Saigon. I've never been in combat, so it's all, for me, it was also from second source, from a film, from a book. The idea of romance in war is something I don't think I've seen. Of course, the sniper girl, I made so many versions of this. And I actually, people ask me about performance. And I think if there was another Asian woman there or person, I would have used that person. So it was out of necessity. So I think I worked on this project for about 2 or 3 years. And I think it answered some questions. And just about when I felt that, maybe I wanted something more serious, something more real, we invaded Iraq. So now we're in 2003. So that March, I remember being extremely distraught, thinking about my history, thinking about the consequences, and how I think my family did not suffer in the way many other families have suffered during the war. But I was still trying to understand what happened. And so now we're embarking on another war, and it seemed to me that there's no lesson learned, and we're sending young men and women to war. I was very late in thinking that I should go to Iraq and make some work there. So I was on a wait list for being an embed, but while I was waiting, I saw pictures of the Marines training outside of Los Angeles in Joshua Tree, so not very far. And I loved the landscape, and I thought, well, it could be a great stand-in for Afghanistan or parts of Afghanistan or Iraq. So I made inquiries and was able to go and photograph there. And so this next body of work is called 29 Palms, which is the name of the town, and it's about the training. I think I quickly understood that, these pictures could provide something that's different than frontline news, than what you see in the newspaper. It's not about action, it's not about devastation, it's not about death, it's about people training for war. And so having that distance, that critical distance, maybe gives you the space to think on a larger and broader context. I love the idea of, the scale. So we have the individual here, but then we also have, the landscape. And so it's about moving troops, it's about moving supplies across lands, and it's about the unknowable, which is, I think, in spite of the fact that, the American military is, at least, right now, still all powerful, I think there's an unknowable, uncontrollable force that is the land, the landscape, the weather that looms over all of this, and that tension interests me. I think spending time in 29 Palms allowed me to speak to the Marines, to have conversations with them. I think I came to understand what it meant to join the military. It's not that these guys are not political. I think they had opinions, but you join the military and you check out your rights of choice, right? So Bush decided to go to war, so we go to war. But they have opinions, and these young men and women are actually very political. And I think I heard from them before I saw in the news that the war was going nowhere. It's so interesting to me that the landscape where this training is taking place is also the landscape that Timothy O'Sullivan photographed in his survey of the West. And this is sort of my little homage to that picture that you know well of the horse carriage drawn that he has. Beauty is something that I think about a lot. Being a view camera photographer, you think of proportions, your camera's always straight, things are not skewed, and so it kind of Most of the time, it forces you to make a picture that is more formal. And so beauty is something that I struggled with. And I think that ultimately, you know, it's about, I have no issues with it because it's about complicated beauty. And you use beauty to draw somebody in. And I think when you relate beauty to something such as, this is all live fire, so they're real explosives. You know, we wear flak jackets and helmets, and it goes back to the sublime. So, you know, you see something that's beautiful, it's very scary, but, you know, you're still safe. And so it's something that I thought about a lot. You know, I went to 29 Palms the first year we invaded Iraq, and so the tenor of the training changed rapidly. So suddenly, instead of moving tanks and troops, they turned the trainings into a kind of urban training. And this was before they thought to build minarets and bring in Arab linguists. They still had mostly Russian linguists, but they grabbed a bunch of housings and just office housing, abandoned housings, and just scrawled all of this graffiti they had seen in Iraq. And I thought it was so telling what the message is underneath. And there's something about, you know, I think in great pictures you have something about the objective and the subjective, that the two things that I always try to play with. And I think interesting pictures are the ones where the underpinnings of both come together and allows you to experience something in a complicated way. I photographed there for, I think, 2 or 3 years, and the Marines invited me to come to sea with them. They train on the coast of California before they get shipped off to the Middle East. And I think of myself as a landscape photographer, and I thought, well, you know, maybe this is a great opportunity to explore the ocean. You know, it's such a great place. It's a place, you know, I think of frontiers, and I think of exploring the unknown. I think of man's confrontation with greater unknowable forces. So it seemed that there was a lot of potential. And of course, I love Gustave Le Gray, and I thought, you know, at first, well, I'll just make a few pictures like these or something similar, or reinvent that, and then that would be it, and I'll move on to something else. It took me a few years, but, you know, I did make one of these. But as I started traveling with them, I found out that the Navy, with the Marines, and in a way, something about, I think, the whole experience of the military, they're everywhere. They do humanitarian missions, they support science, they collect information, they are at war, of course, in the Gulf, so in theater. You have, they support all the troops, and the Navy ships fly all the jets to drop bombs. You know, they win hearts and minds, so they're everywhere. And I think the more I knew about them, I thought, you know, I should really try to see everything and experience everything. This is a picture I made, you know, somewhere in the middle of the project, and I ended up traveling with them for 9 years. I would take 3-4 trips every year, and I think once you start, you know, you felt you needed a framework, and I thought, well, they're everywhere in every continent. I should go to all the continents. I don't think that I'm particularly experienced to, and this is my, you know, Turner, of course. I don't think that I'm equipped to explore other cultures, because they go to Africa, they go to Asia, but I thought it would be interesting to see the points of tensions and contacts, you know, when they come into contact with another culture, or when they come into contact with civilians. These are details. I think that this project posed new problems for me. I don't really have a concept anymore. With the reenactors, there was the idea of the reenactments. With 29 Palms, the training. So now I'm in color and I'm photographing in real time, and I think my struggle at this point was, well, how are these different from pictures in National Geographic? Aircraft carriers, you see those pictures all the time. What makes these different? And I think that what makes these different is that, and I think Philip Lopate has written some great things about nonfiction writing. And I think that what he says is that, when you read great nonfiction, you feel that you're constantly engaged by the mind of the writer, and you feel that you're engaged in their struggle in trying to define ideas, their struggle to deal with paradoxical things. And so I think that this was a perfect opportunity for me to try to explore my conflicted ideas about the military. It's not as simple as, are you for or against the military? It's so easy to have these sound bites and to wear the yellow ribbon and say, I support the troops, but it's much more complicated than that. I'm interested in the soldiers and the Marines, and I grew up as a tomboy, so being in a helicopter or landing on the flight deck, going 200 miles an hour to 0 in 3 seconds is really extraordinary, or being catapulted, from the deck of an aircraft carrier. I love all that stuff. So I think I realized that it's okay to just keep it all. So you could be fascinated by the gear, by the machinery, and also have questions about what it means to join the military, or this big lumbering enterprises that spends, $1 million a year on some aircraft carriers, on maintenance of aircraft carriers. It's insane. I think this is an interesting picture, So again, that idea of being so fascinated by things when you go somewhere for the first time. This is a picture that I made early on, and it's called a FOD walk. So this is when the sailors walk down the flight path to see if there's any bits and pieces of metal, and they pick it up because otherwise it gets sucked into the jet engines and destroy the plane. And it's the most spectacular and colorful things you'll see at sea because everything else is camouflage and gray. And eventually, I made this one, which is so reduced, and it's not so much about the description of the activity, and it's more about this line of sailors becoming the horizon. But as you get close, you can see the faces and you can see the individuals. And, I see Texas, I see California, I see Rhode Island. Each one of these people have a particular story. I think as I worked, I also realized that, not being a National Geographic photographer, this is a picture of target shooting. I don't have to show them actually holding a gun and shooting. I think we all know what that is, and this is so much more interesting to me. The way the outlines of the targets kind of mimic, the profile or the back of one of the sailors. And this is definitely not something that I could even make up, and the world is, again, full of surprises. I think the beauty is when perhaps you see a photograph and it answers questions that you had never thought you would have, and it answers it in a really beautiful and complicated ways. The Suez Canal. This became a 5-part piece. It was very difficult to set up. But I think this is also about problem solving. And so I'm on the aircraft carrier, and it's moving on the Suez Canal. And so the landscape's moving, and it's so narrow you don't see the water. And so, you know, if you had one picture, you could possibly be on a pier. And so I decided to make it a 5-piece that would suggest the passing of time. It suggests this kind of collision between, you know, the military culture and that ancient culture that is Egypt. Something about agriculture also, but you know, I'm not a portrait photographer, even though it's hard not to make a picture of someone, you know, when you spend a lot of time at sea. And I think these pictures, these portraits of women worked for me because I really became fascinated by the role of women in the military and how competent they are and how they step up and do everything, but also have to carve a space for themselves. So that idea of scale, I think, applies for me when we talk about portraits as well. So this woman, you know, found the tight shirt and her eyebrows are plucked and she's so beautiful. This woman is very young. She's at the bottom of the rank. Grace here, you know, is a plane captain, which means she delivers a plane completely functional without any problems to the pilot. She's one of the guys. She's great. You know, I made portraits of men too, but I don't think they're that interesting. I just love the woman, you know, and maybe having kids and thinking about the future and what it means for a woman to carve a place for herself. It's a tough world, and they do it. The military cares about the way it's seen, you know. I was told you shouldn't have pictures of people smiling, but here's Mr. Spock, and the lady is one of the highest-ranked admiral in operations at the time, and she was amazing. So, you know, you're on the ships, and you dock, and then you go on land and for a training, and you get back on the ship, and this is in Hawaii. And it's a multinational training with sailors from Southeast Asia, from Canada. There was a Russian ship. I think it was the first time a Russian ship entered Pearl Harbor. And I stuck around long enough for the Navy, for the U.S. military to return to Vietnam to train with them. And so they are, of course, bitterest enemies, and now they're training together. So I was able to make this picture, which was completely set up. This was on a hospital ship. So before the Navy started training with the Vietnamese, they brought a hospital ship to win hearts and mind, and had it docked off the coast of, I think it was Da Nang, Quy Nhon, for about a week. And they did short operations, and as soon as I saw this nun, I just followed her. And made a photograph of her in the waiting room on the hospital ship. And I tried different versions, and I had an escort, and I sat him down, and it turned out that he was also a Buddhist. And so, you know, this picture sometimes I feel is very forced, but it's okay, you know. I think that idea of what's beyond the edge of the picture is important. Again, the objective and the subjective here at play. They both have uniforms. They both belong to structures that are, you know, peace and war and you know, everything you can think of. My pictures rely on very simple, nerdy titles with the location, and maybe this is called, I can't remember exactly, but it's a humanitarian mission right after the earthquake. So it's about bringing supplies. It's like, and because I believe that there's so much from all the details that suggest, I think, the invisible and it's what's beyond the frame that's interesting to me. And it's also the way each picture adds up to what was previously. So in a way, this whole body of work called Events Ashore is a kind of big, long essay about this exploration of the military and how complicated it is, and I think my very mixed feelings about the whole enterprise. You know, the American soldiers behave differently than any other forces. You know, these guys just arrive in Haiti and they're already behaving like they own the land. You know, so I think there's something about a fine line between coming to help and then invading. They train. They go to different countries and train. This is a piracy training. These guys who are part of the civil affairs arm of the Navy, I think they're CIA, they were there teaching English on this island of Comoros in the Indian Ocean, which is like nobody goes there. Yeah, so tensions between cultures, you know, I think for me it's always, well, who knows more and who's more experienced. So we have more resources, but what does it really mean? Maybe it doesn't mean anything. And so how do you subvert, expectations? This is obviously not a Black Power kind of gesture, but I took advantage of that. This is in Ghana, and these Marines came to this village to help them set up a kind of emergency plan because there's a dam right next to the village, and there's always a chance of it breaking. There's a kind of an outlier to that project. The Navy is in Antarctica and in the Arctic, and so this is called Church of the Snow, a Chapel of the Snow, and it's the southernest church on Earth. It's in Antarctica, and the Navy supports science there, and they fly the planes, they bring supplies. This is South Pole Station. This is in the Arctic. They support scientists. How am I doing time-wise? This is a bit of a long story, but I'll make it short, and I think it's very interesting. I was on this icebreaker, and it's run by the Coast Guard, because I didn't think that I could ever be, and you'll see later, I got on a submarine in the Arctic, but I never thought I could get on a Navy submarine. So second best Coast Guard, but I actually love them. So I spent, I went on 2 trips with the Coast Guards, and they supported science. So they brought these biologists who radio tag walruses to study their mating and feeding patterns, and they use bow and arrow to radio tag those walruses. They need to go far from the icebreaker. So whenever the icebreaker stops, they get in a helicopter and they get flown out to wherever they needed to go. And I love the way I love the outfit. It's like homemade. I just love what they wear. I love the idea of the bow and arrow. And I told them, let me come. I want to photograph you. And, weeks went by. And then we can't take you. If we take you, no fuel, blah, 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 blah. So a few days left. And I just broke down. And I said, can we just do it next to the ship the next time we stop? And they said, yes, we'll do that just for you. It takes them a while to get dressed, and you get really hot in the icebreaker because, it's cold outside. So, 2 days later, we were going to do it. So in the meantime, this TV crew showed up. And, of course, the Coast Guard tries to get some publicity, so they brought a TV station on to kind of film what the scientists were doing. There had been journalists from NPR on the icebreaker a few days before. And, everyone wants to be friends with her, and she's so smart, and she's so nice. But anyway, the day comes where I go down and make my picture. So we have lunch, and then we go down. And as soon as those guys walk out on the deck with their outfit and starts walking down the plank, everyone just goes crazy. So the TV crew rushes down there, And I'm trying to set up my camera, and they stand in front of me, and I get all upset and said, wait, I'll do my picture, then you can do whatever, and we're kind of like arguing. And the journalist from NPR walks down the plank, and she's just up in arms. She says, how dare you guys? This is a reenactment. How could you film it? You got to make sure that it's a reenactment. And she was really, really upset. And I just froze, and I turned bright red, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to think I'm a jerk, I've been wanting to be friends with her and all this stuff. And I'm just standing there frozen. But she walks over to me, and she said, it's okay for you to photograph them, but not for the TV crew, because she understood that I was an artist. And so I think there's something there in terms of photographing in the real world. You don't have to follow this kind of ethical guideline. You can change things, and you can reenact, and you can flip-flop, and it's all okay, as long as it's coherent, that you're getting somewhere. So it's a long story, too. And this is my submarine. I actually spent 24 hours in the submarine, and this is not far from the North Pole. And I think towards the end of the book, I put in a lot of pictures that make you question this whole enterprise of war, or the idea of the fog of war from the McNamara documentary. You see it and you don't see it. Barry Turner. This is one of the last pictures I made. This is these guys who work in explosive ordnance. And I thought I needed an equivalent to those night explosions I had in 29 Palms. It'd be great to get explosions in the water. But it turned out they never really served what they promised me, and they said, well, maybe you could photograph this biohazard exercise. In the end, they didn't even let me into the tunnel, and I just stood outside forever. And I think I was so desperate, and I thought, well, let's just make a picture. And, it was like really boring. The guy's just getting undressed. But I think I got home, and I looked at this photograph, and he's become such a minotaur, with a third leg sticking out back there. And I think it's such a great case for how the world provides incredible surprises and incredible gifts if you are open to receiving those gifts. This is the captain of a ship during the first training in Vietnam, an American captain. I love her posture in comparison to the other officers, the Vietnamese officers. Guantanamo, Camp Justice. And so, it's a kind of meandering that is a trip that ultimately is what this series is about. The last picture is the American officers returning to Vietnam, and this is their formal ceremony. So something about this closing of the loop and perhaps lessons not learned, I don't know. I think the hardest part, as you all know, is when you finish a project and you don't know what to do next. I was given a gift. I was invited by the film director Gary Ross to come down on the set of this Civil War film he was shooting about 2 years ago in Louisiana. And it was difficult. I'd never done commissions. I wasn't sure what he wanted. But they had an on-set photographer, and basically, I was an indulgence. And I think Gary liked the idea, had researched the Civil War photographer so much, he liked the idea of having the view camera on the battlefield. And so I made a bunch of pictures, and they're everything that I loved. This collision of, it's something happening in real time, but there's a conflation of history. It's not a reenactment. But I didn't think that these pictures alone would be sufficient. I had some other small commission right afterwards to do something in New Orleans, so I decided to photograph the Confederate monuments, and this is about a year and a half ago when they started being contested. And so I made these pictures that a field on fire, it's a sugarcane field, you know, and it had undertones of the Civil War and this antebellum symbolism for me. I think what really kind of pushed me forward was receiving an invitation to be in the Whitney Biennial, and I knew that I had a limited amount of time, limited amount of space. What did I want the work to be about? And of course, this was also during the moment leading up to the election, 2016. I was outraged and really upset by, I think, the language that was being thrown around, all the debates, and I think this kind of trading on simplistic ideas about race, about immigration, about the economy, and I thought, you know, it could be good to try to explore those tensions in a complicated way. And so I put together, you know, a series of pictures that I thought could suggest what the situation is and maybe also start posing the questions of the tensions. I think the limited space kind of forced me to consider this idea of a suite of pictures and this idea of fragment. And I came across Walt Whitman's Specimen Days, which are all fragments. And I was very inspired by one particular one called Silent General, and I used that title, but I think, you know, I took inspiration by the whole work. This was the morning after elections in New Orleans. And again, I love the idea that it could be the current president, it could be a president in the past. And since we're talking about contested Confederate monuments and everything, the idea of, you know, the anonymous day worker. This was actually on a boat deck owned by a Vietnamese fisherman in Louisiana, but I was not able to make anything with the Vietnamese. And the swamp. And so there were 7 pictures that is part of the first fragment, and I got really inspired by the fact that Specimen Days is also a kind of autobiography. You know, he went back and used his notes from the Civil War and incorporated those. He tried to talk about his childhood. He spoke about himself through a description of the geography of the country, the geology. It's really a beautiful mix that is very poetic, but also very descriptive. And Whitman was a journalist, and so you can read something, and his descriptions are just so visual. And then he goes into something very complicated and poetic. And so I think, you know, I felt that it kind of gave me license to draw pictures that may seem disparate, and that it was perfectly okay. And I think it was a relief for me not to be working on some big project and go somewhere and know that all the pictures would be there. And actually now I don't really know where I'm going next. But I know that the idea of the monument as a control, what the monument stands for, the way it tries to control history versus a film set, which is about controlling the narrative, and then the everyday that is a little bit more uncontrollable. And I think it's about a mix of those. So these are more pictures from the film set, and I haven't worked out the next fragment, but it's going to involve some of these. And these are the monuments from New Orleans that were actually pulled down last spring, and they're now in storage in New Orleans, so I was able to photograph them. These are some runaway slaves on the set of the film. And I'm looking at, you know, going on other film sets as well. This is 4th of July in New Orleans. So, you know, I'm surprised myself I surprised myself by actually being able to photograph almost anywhere. You know, I even bring my camera when I go on family vacation, and sometimes I make one picture, and it's actually a decent picture. So it feels free, but it also is a little scary, or it's very scary. I think what happened this summer also, which forced me to again consider this idea of photographing something that is current news, that is unfolding. You know, so we had, you know, the protest in Virginia, and I think it just seemed that everything kind of caught up with me so quickly, and I felt that I needed to go down there. But I knew that it wasn't where I should be. So the question is, where should you be? And I think I told a close friend, I was stuck on the couch for 3 or 4 days watching the news, not knowing what to do next, but knowing that, you know, it's big. And so I waited, and then I went, which is just down this, you know, not far, I went down to Eastern Parkway and photographed the Lubavitchers looking at the eclipse. And I felt this was maybe a great strategy that, you know, I didn't check the box, that I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism. These are more pictures from the film set. You know, I was in New Mexico for work, to give a talk, and I felt that they were pictures that were relevant with what's going on. This is back to the film set. They're actually Iraq War veterans who played these wounded soldiers. So that's where I am right now, and you know, I've made films. I started an embroidery project. I don't know. I hope you guys have questions. I think the one thing I didn't really mention, the idea of the autobiography, because we talked about it before. I gave a talk to, my husband teaches photography at Yale, and I went up there as a favor and gave a talk to his students last month. And he said something that was interesting. He said, you know, you talk about yourself, you have all these stories, but you never really talk about living through the war. And so, yes, you know, I mean, when I was a kid, you go to school, and then the gate of the school is like smoking because some mortar just fell on it. Or when Ziem was assassinated, you know, we had to rush away, and my mom's always stockpiling food. My mom was airlifted from the American embassy and ended up on an aircraft carrier, you know. So and Tet 68, you know, it was right down in front of our apartment building. So I think it's important, but it's not that important, because I think that, and again, I go back to Philip Lopate. He says, well, how do you make autobiographical work that is interesting? Basically, how do you escape this kind of narcissistic trap, right, of the self? And so I think you start there, but you need to be curious about the world, and you need to ask questions, and you need to go out there. And I think, in a way, that's what it means for me to make work that's autobiographical. And of course, it colors the way you see things, and my empathy for the military at times, or my affection, because, you know, they saved my life. I would have ended up, you know, my family would have ended up, my father would have been in a rare education camp for 10, 12 years, I don't know. And so, you know, at the same time, the military completely destroyed Vietnam. So it's about being able to navigate all of those things.